Don't eat that. The words never left her mouth, but they burned behind Ava Brooks' lips as she stood 3 feet behind the man in the tailored gray jacket, her tray balanced steady in one hand while the low amber lights of the restaurant cast soft reflections across polished glass and silverware. He had just cut into the steak, medium rare, exactly as ordered, but the moment the blade slid through the center, something shifted in the air, a scent, subtle, sour, wrong, brushed against her senses like a warning. She couldn't ignore. The dining room hummed with quiet conversations, the soft clink of forks against porcelain, the distant hiss of a grill from the open kitchen, but inside Ava's chest, everything tightened, slowed, sharpened. She had trained for this once, long before overdue bills and hospital visits forced her into double shifts and late nights, back when culinary school kitchens taught her that the smallest detail could mean everything. And this was wrong. At table 12, Ethan Cole lifted the first bite, his posture relaxed, unaware, just another customer in a place that prided itself on perfection, but Ava's eyes locked onto that fork as if time itself hesitated, her fingers curling slightly around the edge of the tray, the cool metal grounding her as her thoughts raced. Protocol said say nothing, trust the kitchen, stay in line, especially when the floor manager was already watching too closely tonight. Already waiting for a mistake, she felt his gaze somewhere behind her, sharp and impatient, the kind that reminded her exactly where she stood in this room. Still, the smell lingered, faint but unmistakable, and with it came a memory she never fully buried, a quiet hospital room, the steady beep of machines, the silence that followed when no one had spoken up soon enough. Ava inhaled slowly, her breath shallow, controlled, as Ethan finally raised the fork toward his mouth, and in that instant, something inside her settled. Not fear, not hesitation, but decision. Her hand moved before permission could catch up, setting the tray down just long enough to pull a pen from her apron pocket. The paper was nothing special, just a small order slip, but her writing came fast, urgent, pressed into the fibers like it mattered more than anything else in that moment. She didn't look at him as she stepped forward again, didn't break the invisible rules that kept people like her quiet, small, unseen. She simply adjusted the napkin beside his plate, her fingers brushing the table with practiced ease as she slipped the folded note beneath its edge. A movement so subtle it vanished into the rhythm of service. Then she stepped back, heart pounding just enough to echo in her ears, the weight of what she'd done settling into her shoulders as the manager's voice cut low from behind her, sharp and controlled. "Ava, what was that?" But she didn't answer, couldn't, because across the table, Ethan's hand paused mid-motion, the fork hovering just inches from his mouth as his eyes flickered downward, catching the corner of the paper she had left behind, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he set the fork down and reached for it, unfolding the note under the warm glow of the overhead light, his expression shifting, not yet alarm, not yet understanding, just a crack in certainty as he read the words she hadn't dared to say out loud, "Don't eat it. Please trust me." The paper stayed in his hand longer than it should have, the edges slightly creased between his fingers as the low murmur of the restaurant carried on around him like nothing had changed. But something had. Ava could feel it from where she stood near the service station, her pulse still uneven, her eyes fixed on the small shift in his posture as he read the note again, slower this time, his brow tightening just enough to betray that he was not dismissing it. Ethan Cole had spent years learning to filter noise from signal, to separate instinct from paranoia, and yet this moment did not feel like either. It felt precise, deliberate, the kind of interruption that did not belong in a place built on control and expectation. He glanced down at the steak, the surface glistening under the soft light, nothing visibly wrong, nothing that would alarm a typical guest, but the words lingered, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just quiet and direct, and that was what unsettled him most. Across the room, Ava forced herself to move, to continue her routine, refilling water, clearing plates, maintaining the rhythm that kept suspicion away. But every step felt measured against the weight of what she had done, the manager's presence tightening behind her like a shadow, his voice low and restrained as he stepped closer. "You do not interrupt guests like that, especially not without clearance." His tone controlled but edged with warning, the kind that did not need to be raised to be understood. Ava nodded once, her gaze lowered briefly, not in submission but in calculation, because she knew arguing would only make things worse, and worse was not something she could afford tonight. Back at the table, Ethan set the fork down completely, his fingers now resting on the table as he leaned back slightly, observing, not reacting, the way he did when something did not add up. His eyes scanning the room with quiet precision before returning to the note, then to the kitchen visible. Through the open pass, where movement continued as usual, cooks plating, flames rising, nothing outwardly wrong, and yet the unease remained. He raised his hand just enough to signal, not urgently, not dramatically, but enough to draw Ava back to the table. She approached carefully, her steps steady even as her heartbeat pressed against her ribs, the space between them shrinking until she stood just within reach, her posture composed. Her expression neutral, the practiced calm of someone used to being watched. Ethan looked at her for a moment, longer than a typical customer would, his gaze not dismissive, not condescending, but searching, as if weighing the cost of believing a stranger against the cost of ignoring her. "What is this?" he asked quietly, holding the note just enough for her to see it again, his voice low, controlled, carrying no accusation, only a question that demanded precision. Ava's throat tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of choosing her next words carefully, because this was the line she had already crossed once, and crossing it again would leave no way back. "It is just a suggestion, sir," she replied softly, her tone even, respectful, but not apologetic, her eyes meeting his for a brief second before lowering again, not out of weakness, but because she knew how easily confidence could be misread. The manager stepped closer, his presence now fully inserted into the space, his smile tight and professional as he addressed Ethan. "I apologize for any confusion, sir. Everything from our kitchen is held to the highest standard." His words polished, rehearsed, designed to restore control, but Ethan did not look at him, not yet, his attention still fixed on Ava, on the steadiness in her voice, the absence of hesitation, the quiet certainty that did not match the role she was expected to play. And in that silence, stretched thin between protocol and instinct, he made a decision that shifted the balance of the room without a single raised voice. He pushed the plate slightly away from him, just an inch, but enough, and said calmly, "I will wait." The word lingered in the air, quiet but heavy, and it shifted everything around that table in a way no raised voice ever could, because waiting in a place built on speed and precision was not normal. It was disruption, it was doubt made visible. The manager's smile held for a second too long before tightening at the edges, his eyes flicking briefly toward the kitchen as if calculating the distance between control and exposure. "Sir, I can assure you," he began again, voice still polished but now carrying a faint strain beneath it, "there is absolutely no need to delay your meal." But Ethan did not move, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was no longer just a customer following the flow of service. He was observing, measuring, waiting for something unseen to reveal itself. Ava stepped back half a pace, giving space without leaving, her hands loosely folded in front of her apron, the fabric worn but clean, her breathing now slower, steadier, as if she had already accepted whatever consequence might follow, her eyes not fixed on Ethan anymore but drifting toward the open kitchen, watching the line with a focus that did not belong to someone who only carried plates. Inside the kitchen, the rhythm faltered for just a moment, barely noticeable. Unless someone was looking for it, a cook pausing mid-motion, another glancing toward the pass where the untouched steak sat under the heat lamps, the surface beginning to dull as seconds stretched longer than they should, and then a quiet exchange, low voices, quick, controlled, but not invisible. Ethan caught it, not the words, but the change, the slight disruption in what should have been seamless, and it confirmed something he had learned long ago. That truth rarely announced itself loudly. It revealed itself in the small fractures people thought no one would notice. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the table, the note still beside his plate, and without looking at the manager, he spoke again, calm, deliberate. "Who prepared this dish?" The question simple, but placed with intent. The manager hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before responding. "Our head chef oversees all orders, sir." A safe answer, one that redirected responsibility. Without naming it, but Ethan did not nod, did not accept it, his eyes now shifting briefly to Ava, then back to the kitchen, as if connecting pieces that were not meant to be connected. Ava felt that glance, brief but precise, and something in her chest tightened again, not fear, but recognition, because he was not dismissing her, he was following the line she had drawn. A server passed by with a tray. The scent of another dish cutting clean and fresh through the air, and it only made the difference more obvious, the contrast between what should be and what was sitting untouched on table 12. The manager stepped slightly closer to the table now, his voice lowering further, almost a whisper meant only for Ethan. "If there is any concern, we can replace it immediately." But even as he said it, his eyes flicked once more toward the kitchen, quick, sharp, as if waiting for something to be corrected before it could be seen. Ethan followed that glance, and this time he did not look away, his attention locking onto a single station where a pan was being moved off the heat too quickly, where a cook reached for a different tray, where something was being adjusted not out of routine, but out of reaction. The silence stretched again, thinner now, charged with something just beneath the surface, and Ava stood still within it, her presence quiet but unyielding, because she knew this moment did not belong to her anymore, it belonged to the truth slowly making its way into the open, one small detail at a time. The shift in the kitchen did not settle back into rhythm, it deepened, subtle at first, then undeniable, like a quiet mistake trying to hide behind routine, and Ethan saw it clearly now, not because it was obvious, but because he had learned to notice what others ignored. A cook wiped his hands too quickly, another reached for a tray that did not belong to his station, and the head chef, a man who had carried himself with absolute control moments earlier, now stood half-turned, speaking in low tones that did not match the calm expected of a flawless service. Ethan leaned back slightly, his chair barely making a sound against the polished floor, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpened, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried just enough to reach both the manager and the kitchen without ever rising above the hum of the room. "Bring me the original cut," he said, each word measured, deliberate. The manager blinked once, caught off balance for the first time. "Sir?" he asked, the single syllable buying him seconds he did not have. Ethan's gaze did not shift. "The one that was plated before this," he clarified, his fingers tapping lightly once against the table, not impatient, but precise. Across the room, Ava felt the air tighten, her shoulders still, her breath shallow again, because this was no longer about a quiet warning, this was exposure. The manager's posture straightened, his smile returning but thinner now, stretched over something less certain. "I assure you, sir, every dish meets." But Ethan lifted a hand slightly, not dismissive, just enough to stop the sentence before it could finish. "Please," he said, softer now, but somehow more final. The word landed heavier than anything louder could have, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the manager turned, not abruptly, but with a controlled urgency that betrayed him more than any mistake could, his steps quickening as he crossed into the kitchen, his voice dropping into a sharp whisper the moment he was out of reach of the guests. And even without hearing the words, the shift in tone told the story. Ava's eyes followed him, then moved to the pass where the steak still sat, its surface no longer glistening under the heat lamp, the edges beginning to dry, time leaving its mark in ways no one could reverse. Seconds stretched, then a minute, long enough for nearby tables to notice the delay, long enough for the quiet hum of conversation to tilt into curiosity, and Ethan remained still through all of it, his presence calm but immovable, as if he had all the time in the world and no intention of letting this moment pass unexamined. When the manager returned, he carried a plate, similar, identical at a glance, but not the same, and that was the problem. He set it down carefully. His smile restored, his tone steady again. "A fresh preparation, sir," he said, placing it exactly where the previous one had been. Ethan did not touch it, did not even look at it immediately. Instead his eyes lifted slowly to meet the manager's, holding there for a beat longer than politeness required, then drifting past him to the kitchen where the original plate was no longer visible, and in that quiet space between what was shown and what had been removed, the truth settled in, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of weight that could not be ignored. "Ava," stood where she was, hands still, heart steady now, because she understood what he had just proven without saying it, that something had been changed, and that someone had tried to make it disappear, and in a room built on perfection, that was the one flaw no one could hide. The new plate sat untouched in front of him, steam rising in thin, controlled lines under the warm overhead light, but Ethan did not reach for it, did not even glance down at it for more than a second, because the absence of the first plate spoke louder than anything now placed in front of him. His fingers rested lightly on the table, still, composed, while the note remained beside his hand like a quiet witness to everything that had just unfolded, and when he finally looked up, his eyes did not carry anger, they carried clarity, the kind that made people uncomfortable without a single raised voice. The manager held his position, posture straight, expression fixed and practiced calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw now, a slight delay in his breathing, small fractures that only appeared when control began to slip. "Where is the original dish?" Ethan asked, his tone even, almost casual, but the question landed with precision, cutting through the carefully restored atmosphere. The manager hesitated again, not as briefly this time, his gaze flickering toward the kitchen before returning. "It has been discarded, sir," he replied, choosing his words carefully, as if each one needed to hold under pressure. Ethan nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if confirming something he already knew, then leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving past the manager to the kitchen once more, tracing the path of movement, the tension still lingering beneath the surface. "That is unfortunate," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach, not just the manager, but the space around them, the nearby tables, the staff who were now pretending not to listen. Ava felt the shift ripple outward, subtle but real, the kind of silence that grows when people sense something is not right but cannot yet name it. She stood where she was, no longer moving through tasks, no longer blending into the background, because this moment had already pulled her out of that role, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The manager stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice again. "Sir, we are committed to your experience, and I can personally guarantee this replacement meets every standard." His words smooth, controlled, but now carrying an edge of urgency that had not been there before. Ethan's gaze returned to him, steady, unblinking. And for a brief moment, the two men stood on opposite sides of something neither of them named, one trying to contain, the other simply observing. "I am sure you believe that," Ethan replied, calm, measured, not dismissive, but not accepting either, and then, almost as an afterthought, his eyes shifted again, this time directly to Ava. The look was brief, but it held weight, acknowledgement without spectacle, recognition without words, and Ava felt it settle in her chest in a way she did not expect, because she was not used to being seen in moments like this. The manager followed that glance instinctively, his eyes landing on her, and for the first time, his expression changed openly. The professional mask thinning into something sharper, more pointed, a silent question of how far this had gone and who had allowed it. Ava did not look away this time, her posture still, her hands steady at her sides, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, and in that quiet standoff, where no voices were raised and no accusations spoken aloud, the truth stood between them, clear and undeniable, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. The silence did not break, it settled, deeper and heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath, and for the first time since the plate had been set down, no one moved to fill the space. The soft glow of the pendant lights reflected off the untouched steak, the surface beginning to lose its warmth, the thin trail of steam fading into nothing, and in that quiet, Ava became aware of every small detail. The faint hum of the refrigeration units behind the bar, the distant clink of glass being set too carefully onto a tray, the way the air felt just slightly colder against her skin. Ethan did not speak, not immediately, his gaze lowering to the note once more, his thumb brushing lightly over the fold as if grounding himself in something real. Something simple in a moment that had become layered with unspoken tension. He had been in rooms louder than this, filled with arguments, negotiations, voices competing for control, but this kind of silence, this kind that revealed rather than concealed, was rarer and more telling. Across from him, the manager shifted his weight subtly, A small adjustment that betrayed discomfort despite the composed exterior, his hands clasped just a little tighter in front of him, as if holding on to the structure of authority that was beginning to slip. Ava stood still, her shoulders relaxed but her spine straight, not out of defiance, but out of something steadier, a quiet acceptance of whatever followed, because she had already made her choice the moment she wrote that note. The kitchen behind them had slowed, not visibly enough for most guests to notice, but enough that the rhythm was no longer seamless, a slight delay between movements, a pause where there should have been flow. And Ethan could feel it without needing to look. He lifted his eyes again, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to observe, and when his gaze met Ava's once more, it lingered just a fraction longer, not searching now, but understanding. Something passed in that moment, not spoken, not acknowledged aloud, but clear. She had not acted out of impulse, she had acted out of certainty. The manager cleared his throat quietly, the sound almost too small to register, but in the stillness it echoed more than intended. "Sir, if there is anything further I can do," he began, his voice carefully measured, as if choosing each word with precision could restore the balance that had shifted, but the sentence did not finish, because Ethan raised his hand again, gently this time, not to interrupt, but to pause the moment before it could be redirected. He exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, deliberate, and then leaned forward just slightly, his voice low when it came, carrying only to those who needed to hear it. "There is," he said, calm, steady, and in that single phrase the quiet in the room deepened, not with tension now, but with anticipation, because whatever came next would no longer be hidden behind polished words or careful service. It would step into the light that silence had already prepared. The words did not come quickly, and that was what made them land with weight, because Ethan did not rush, did not fill the silence with explanations or raise demands. He simply let the moment hold until every eye that needed to notice had already turned in quiet awareness. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying a calm that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. "I want to see the storage logs for this cut," he said, each word precise, leaving no space for misinterpretation. The manager blinked, the composure cracking just enough now to reveal the strain beneath, because this was no longer about replacing a dish or smoothing over a complaint. This was documentation, accountability, something that could not be corrected with a fresh plate. "Sir, that is internal information," the manager replied, his tone still polite but now edged with resistance, a line drawn carefully but visibly. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, grounded, like a decision settling into place. "Then bring me the chef who approved it," he said, just as calmly, his gaze steady, not confrontational, simply unwilling to step back. Across the room, Ava felt her breath catch again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that the line had fully moved beyond her, beyond a quiet warning, into something that would not be easily contained. In the kitchen, the movement slowed further, a cook stepping aside, another lowering his voice, the head chef finally turning toward the dining room with a controlled expression that did not quite mask the tension in his jaw. He approached with measured steps, wiping his hands on a clean cloth, the motion deliberate, buying seconds he could not regain. When he reached the table, he nodded once, professional, composed. "Is there a concern with your meal, sir?" he asked, the question formal, practiced, but not entirely steady. Ethan looked at him, not sharply, not accusing, just directly, and in that gaze was something different now, something that no longer belonged to a guest questioning a dish, but to someone assessing a system. "There was," he replied, his voice even, "until it disappeared." And the words settled between them, quiet but undeniable. The chef's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, just enough to confirm what had already been understood, and in that brief moment, the truth moved from suspicion to certainty. Ava stood still, her hands no longer tense, her shoulders no longer tight, because she could feel the shift as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, the moment when the balance tipped and could not be returned. The manager stepped in slightly, attempting to regain control, his voice smoother now, but thinner, stretched over something already unraveling. "We are committed to resolving any misunderstanding," he said, but the word misunderstanding did not hold, not anymore. Ethan reached for the note again, lifting it just slightly, not as evidence, not as accusation, but as a simple reminder of where this had begun, and then he placed it back down, his fingers resting beside it as he spoke once more, softer now, but with a finality that did not need to be raised. It was not a misunderstanding, he said, and in the stillness that followed, no one argued, because the room itself already knew. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and still, and for a moment no one moved, not the chef, not the manager, not even the nearby tables that had slowly gone quiet without realizing it. The truth had already crossed into the open, and now it simply waited for someone to decide what to do with it. The chef exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the confidence he carried earlier no longer as firm. His eyes dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, not toward the manager this time, but toward Ethan, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, less polished, more real. "There was a storage issue earlier today," he admitted carefully, each word measured as if placing them down too quickly would break something. "A delivery that did not meet our usual standard." The manager shifted beside him, tension tightening in his posture, but he did not interrupt, not yet. Ethan listened without reacting, his expression steady, his hands resting calmly on the table. Giving the silence space to carry the weight of what was being said, the chef continued, quieter now. "It should not have made it to service." And that was the moment it became undeniable, not just a suspicion, not just a quiet warning on a folded piece of paper, but a fact spoken aloud. Ava felt it settle in her chest, not as relief, not as victory, but as something quieter, something closer to closure, because she had not needed to defend herself, she had only needed to hold her ground long enough for the truth to surface on its own. The manager finally stepped forward, his voice returning, controlled but sharper now. "We were in the process of correcting it," he said quickly, the words moving faster than before. "There was no risk to any guest." But the sentence felt thinner than the silence that followed it, like it was trying to rebuild something already gone. Ethan's gaze shifted to him then, calm, direct, not confrontational, but not yielding either. "You replaced the evidence," he said simply, not accusing, not raising his voice, just stating what had already been seen, and the manager's expression tightened further, the practiced composure no longer enough to fully conceal the strain beneath. Across the room, a glass was set down too softly, a chair shifted, small sounds that marked the return of awareness, the realization that something significant had just unfolded in a space that usually hid its imperfections. Ava stood where she was, her hands relaxed now, her breathing even. Because whatever came next was no longer about proving anything, it was about what others chose to do with what had been revealed. The chef lowered his gaze again, the weight of responsibility settling visibly in his posture, and for the first time, the authority in the room shifted away from titles and roles, towards something quieter, something harder to ignore. Ethan reached for the note once more, folding it carefully. Not discarding it, not dismissing it, but keeping it, as if it mattered. Beyond this moment, and when he looked up again, his voice carried a different tone, still calm, still controlled, but now unmistakably final. "Then fix the system," he said, not as a demand, but as a standard, and in the stillness that followed, no one argued, because they all understood that this was no longer about a single plate on a table, it was about everything that had allowed it to reach there in the first place. The moment did not end with applause or raised voices, it dissolved into something quieter, something heavier, like the room itself had absorbed what had happened and was still deciding how to carry it. The chef stepped back first, his posture no longer rigid, his movements slower. Now, as if each step away from the table carried a weight he could not set down, while the manager remained where he was for a second longer, his expression fixed but hollowed, the structure he relied on no longer holding the same shape. Ethan did not watch them leave, not fully, his attention shifting instead to the table, to the plate that still sat untouched, to the note folded neatly beside his hand, and for a moment, everything around him faded into a soft blur of light and sound. Ava exhaled quietly, the breath leaving her body in a way that felt deeper than relief, her shoulders lowering just slightly, her hands resting still against the fabric of her apron, because nothing dramatic had happened, no confrontation, no spectacle, just truth, steady and undeniable. The dining room slowly returned to motion, conversations picking back up in low tones, silverware meeting plates again. But the rhythm was different now, more aware, more careful, as if something invisible had shifted beneath it all. Ethan reached for the note one last time, his fingers smoothing the fold before slipping it into the inner pocket of his jacket, not as a souvenir, not as evidence, but as something that mattered, something that would not be forgotten when he walked out of the room. Then he stood, not abruptly, not with urgency, just a simple movement that carried quiet finality. His chair sliding back with a soft sound against the floor. The manager returned quickly, as if trying to reclaim the moment before it fully passed, his voice measured again. "Sir, your meal can be." But Ethan shook his head slightly, a small gesture that ended the sentence before it could begin, not dismissive, not harsh, just complete. He placed a few bills on the table, more than the cost of the meal, more than expected, but without drawing attention to it, without explanation, and then his gaze shifted once more, not to the manager, not to the chef, but to Ava. It was brief, but it held something clear, something simple, recognition without hierarchy, respect without announcement, and Ava felt it in the stillness between them, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need words to exist. She did not step forward, did not speak, her posture steady, her expression calm, because she understood that this was not a moment for response, it was a moment to let things settle as they were. Ethan turned then, walking toward the exit, his steps even, unhurried, the soft glow of the restaurant lights fading behind him as the door opened and closed with a muted sound, letting in a brief breath of cooler night air before sealing the space again. Inside, Ava remained where she was for a second longer, the noise of the room returning around her, but something inside her quieter now, steadier, as if the weight she had carried had shifted into something lighter, something clearer. She reached for the plate, lifting it carefully, the porcelain cool beneath her fingers, and as she turned back toward the kitchen, the light caught the edge of the table where the note had been, now empty, and in that small absence there was a kind of silence that did not need to be filled, because it already said everything.